the priority of the promise. The priority of the promise over what? Over the law. This week we're exploring the relationship between God's promise to Abraham and the law given on Sinai some 430 years later on.
The title is a bit cryptic, but when you go through the lesson, you start seeing what it means, and it's actually very rich in meaning, very deep study. There is sincere struggle to understand how faith and law work together. For Paul, he is certain on the gospel that he preaches, and it's all about the faithfulness of Jesus, and our response to it is our faith. But how about the law? The Bible talks a lot about it, and it's very important. Today there are so many understandings about this. Some believe that the law had some meaning until Jesus, but not anymore. For others, you have to obey the law in order to be justified. And some have decided that, no, we're being justified by Jesus, but through our obedience to the law, this is how we are being sanctified. Paul begs to differ on all of this.
Paul continues his thoughts in favor of faith over the law when it comes to salvation. And we focus our attention this lesson on the verses 15 to 20 of chapter 3 in the book of Galatians. The apostle begins this passage with reminding us a simple but forgotten truth. In verse 16, the promises were spoken to Abraham personally, he says, and then clarifies in verse 15, just as no one can add to a human contract that has been duly established, so it is in this case. According to the Bible scholars, in the place of the word contract that we just read in verse 15 that Paul uses, they see more likely the original word diatheke, which carries the meaning of a will. So God spoke his will to Abraham, constituting his promise. And Paul clarifies that we cannot add anything after that. So can we personally take him seriously on that?
This is so amazing. God didn't make a deal with humanity. He made a promise. He spoke his will, and he promised to be there for Abraham and his descendants. We are Abraham's descendants, as this promise was extended to us as well.
And if we cannot add anything to the promise, to the will of God, does it mean that then the law that was given later on has been abolished and has been nullified? And this is not my question. Paul is behind this thought in Romans chapter 3 verse 31, and not by accident. But more importantly is, what is his answer to this question? He says, absolutely not. The law has not been abolished and the law has not been nullified. Instead, he says, we uphold the law. So somehow, although we are justified by faith, the law of God has its place and purpose. The question is, what could that be?
Paul is dead serious that the law hasn't been abolished, being done with, etc. Getting to such ideas means that we don't really understand the issue with sin. In chapter 3, verse 19, Paul says some things that are easily misunderstood. Why, then, was the law given at all? It was added because of transgressions, until the seed to whom the promise referred had come. The main questions are, why was the law added or given, and what is the duration? What does this until in the verse means? On the first point, the law wasn't added or as an addendum to God's will or to his promise. It existed long before that. It was introduced to Israel for the purpose to help them understand their situation, to help them see what sin has done to us and to realize how much we need God's grace. The moral law was to reveal that, and the ceremonial was to point to the solution in the sacrifice of Jesus. On the second point, some things that the word until in the verse relates to a duration. So some are saying that it expires then when Jesus came. Others are saying that the ceremonial law only expires when Jesus came. But both are wrong according to the lesson. In the Bible there are many places where the word until doesn't mean that it stops at this point. Here is from the lesson. What Paul is saying is that the coming of Christ marks a decisive turning point in human history. Christ can do what the law could never do: provide a true remedy for sin, that is, justify sinners, and by His Spirit fulfill His law in them.
So according to Paul, the law served a purpose, and the purpose was as a sin revealer or transgression decoder in a way. Moving further on in Galatians chapter 3 verse 24 to 29, the apostle adds up that we were held in custody under the law. We were locked up until the fate that was to come was revealed. And it was revealed when Jesus came, because when He came, we were not under a guardian anymore, says Paul. We have become God's children. This grace is understood thanks to the power of the law.
Looking at the law, which is a reflection of God's character, I see what a wretch I am. But even for this, I need His help, because I am so blinded and so deformed by sin. Growing in this relationship with God, I see more and more how desperate I am without Him. Anything good that comes out of me is the result and the fruit of His work in me. My efforts to obey the law is like pumping muscles on steroids. Should I try not to kill more, not to steal more, to push harder on Sabbath? When God works in me, I realize that it's not just about not killing, but it's about not offending, about caring, about not being selfish, about sacrificing myself. I will never be able to get to the level of the law. I mean, this is God's character. I cannot be God. Only God can do this in me. The law will always be there. The law is good. But I will be on the wrong exercise, on the wrong program if my focus is on that.
And the lesson ends with the initial statement that we started the lesson with, that the promise has a priority, or I would call it a superiority over the law. Our attention is drawn by Paul to the fact, at the end of the lesson, to the fact that when the law was given on Sinai, according to verse 19 and 20, it was mediated by angels and Moses, where in contrast, when Abraham received the promise from God, it was a direct personal encounter with God. So I can conclude that salvation through grace and justification by faith remains the only way. And we cannot add anything, and there is no substitute to it.
The priority of the promise. Hopefully the title makes some good sense now. Join us again next week when the study will continue with the road to faith.